Good afternoon and welcome to the second session of Inviting Biodiversity into Our Garden. I am Renee Baranca, the Manager of Conservation Education and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. The Land Conservancy is Ohio's largest land trust and to date has protected more than 70,000 acres of natural lands, family farms, and urban green spaces. At the Land Conservancy, I plan nature-based programming both virtually and in person for people of all ages. Our goal is to provide a platform to learn and develop a greater appreciation of our natural world. I am pleased to continue our collaboration with the Cleveland Pollinator and Native Plant Symposium and Nature Spark to bring you this 5-part symposium. Through this collaboration, we hope to have an impact in transforming natural spaces into functioning, diverse, beneficial habitats. My co-hosts, Ann Cicerella and Judy Semrek, are passionate about this topic. Ann is the founder of the Cleveland Pollinator and Native Plant Symposium. She works to build connections and inspire conversations about the importance of restoring our fragmented native landscapes, starting with our own backyards and local community plots of land. Judy possesses a wealth of knowledge about our natural world. Through her company, Nature Spark, she works with children and adults in the realm of nature education and exploration. Judy loves to share her nature knowledge through field trips and public programs, both virtually and in person. I thank them both for sponsoring and working with me to bring you this series. I want to point out that this evening, Ann is the presenter at the Northeast Ohio Pollinator Society's Winter Series. She will be talking about the amazing diversity of insects she's found in her beautiful garden. I'll drop a link to that registration in the chat today, and it has been scrolling on the screen since I opened up this webinar. I enjoy moderating this series, and we hope you will join us over the coming weeks as we offer 3 more sessions to help us garden with a purpose. The next session will be next Wednesday, February 1st. We won't be taking a week off, so please remember that you must register for each session individually to be sent the link to watch. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank our sponsors who have made it possible for us to share and offer this symposium for free. Making this event free is important to us, and we couldn't have done it without the support of our partners. Thank you to the Ohio Division of Wildlife, Scioto Gardens, Biodiversity and Landscape Design, the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership for Biodiversity, Audubon Society of Greater Cleveland, Leaves for Wildlife, Natives in Harmony, Avonlea Gardens, Ohio Prairie Nursery, and Meadow City Nursery. And remember, please use the Q&A feature to post your questions. Please don't put questions in the chat. We'll pause for a few questions if time permits following each presentation. Now on to our show. It's my pleasure to introduce Mary Ellen Lemay. Mel is the Landowner Engagement Director at the Aspetuck Land Trust in Connecticut. Today, she will present pollinator pathways and the Green Corridor, improving biodiversity on protected lands in our own backyard. Welcome, Mel. Are you muted, Mel?
Here I am.
Oh, yay. Okay,
You're
great.
not going to believe the mailman just came and my dog was barking.
Oh.
So perfect timing.
That's perfectly
Great.
fine.
I was all ready.
You're great. So you can go ahead and share your screen and
okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Welcome.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. And then okay. All right. There we go. Okay. So I apologize for that mishap. Timing couldn't have been more perfect.
That's perfectly fine. We can hear you and see your program. And if you want to stop your video, then your program will be full screen.
Okay, I can do that. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Renee. And I'm just absolutely delighted to be here today, to be invited for this symposium. This is really impressive. And I have to agree with Renee. It was really a lot of fun to see all the people from all over the country that have joined us today. And this is really, really exciting. So a great opportunity to talk about the landscape and how we really through pollinator pathways and through green corridors, we can begin to connect and reconnect our landscape, not only for pollinators, but for everything else. And so I actually, I'll begin my talk. I will start my timer here. And I am the landowner engagement director for the Aspetuck Land Trust and work specifically on the green corridor, which I'll explain in this talk. But prior to that, I began working on the pollinator pathway here in Connecticut, and that just has expanded into kind of having a life of its own. So I wanted to share with you today, there's a couple of segments to this talk. First, I'm going to start talking about how this began, how the pollinator pathway was launched in 2017, why it seems to be resonating so beautifully with people and spreading across the country, and more importantly, how you can do this in your own town, in your own state, in your own backyard. And then I'm towards the end, I'm going to change hats. I'm going to take my pollinator pathway hat off and put my green corridor Aspetuck Land Trust hat on to help you to understand how we can take deeper dives into biodiversity by planting and keeping track of monitoring and evaluating what shows up. So I will start here. The pollinator pathway numbers keep changing. We have over 280 towns now in over 9 states and thousands of individuals since 2017. The pollinator pathway actually started as a conservation initiative, and H2H means Hudson to Housatonic. So if you can see my cursor, the Hudson River goes up this way all the way to Albany from New York City, and the Housatonic's kind of halfway across the state of Connecticut. And we created a regional conservation partnership that goes over the New York and Connecticut border. And the idea was for land trusts to work together to teach people about creating connectivity across the landscape. And we found that it was very difficult to get people to understand how to weave the landscape together because there was so much fragmentation. And the pollinator pathway idea emerged in 2016 as a landowner engagement tool, an initiative. We got a grant from the US Forest Service to do outreach to landowners, providing trees, of course, but our focus was trees for pollinators. And we bought a whole bunch of dogwoods and started talking to people in lake communities about how what you plant in your backyard will attract pollinators. And it seemed to resonate with people. So from there, we said, let's just try it in other towns besides this one little focus area. And it just grew from there. And I liked this, this phrase, we cannot light another's path without brightening our own. And that seems to be what's happening with the pollinator pathway, is that every time we start a town, then we brighten the pathway to the next town and the next state and the next region. And we're all sharing good news that's really making a difference, not only in our lives, but for pollinators. The other thing that happened in Connecticut in 2016 was the state of Connecticut presented a bill, which was passed, called the Act Concerning Pollinator Health. And this protected pollinators against neonicotinoids, but it also encouraged, actually mandated our Department of Transportation to begin to plant our roadsides with native plants and native grasses. So 2016 was kind of like the perfect storm for this narrative of protecting pollinators. And what we started from there was said, hey, let's launch this from the center point of Wilton, which is where we did our first study. And then let's just see if this will work in other towns. And within 2 years, we had all these towns in New York and Connecticut that said, hey, we want to be on the pollinator pathway. How do we do this? And it went from kind of a pathway design to really a whole town or a whole state design. So the towns are saying, I'm not just going to do this one pathway through the town. my whole town's going to be on the pollinator pathway. And I want people to do the 3 simple things that I'll explain for you to do in their backyards all through the town. So in 2019, after those 2 years of this just exploding, Connecticut Magazine did a profile of the pollinator pathway and what we were doing. And this is the picture of the 4 women that started the pathway. There's, I'm here in the white. And we all have, this is Kim Stoner, who's our state entomologist. We call her our queen bee. She worked with us on launching the pollinator pathway. She's the one that wrote the state law. And then Donna Merrill, who's the one that started the idea of she first started calling it a bee highway and then changed it to pollinator pathway. And then Louise Washer, who is a director of the Norwalk River Watershed Association. So we have quite a multitude of backgrounds and organizations that we work for. And it was kind of funny to have this magazine come out and have 4 50-something women as the centerfold for the Connecticut Magazine. And it really was a centerfold. I was really horrified when I opened the magazine. This picture was the centerfold, but it really put us on the map. And we became unexpected celebrities in Connecticut just by creating this pollinator pathway. So the pathway itself, just to give you an overview, it's really an idea. It's not necessarily an organization. We just became a 501c3 just a few months ago because we thought maybe now we can start raising money for this. But basically it was an idea. It's that shared among existing conservation organizations. It's truly a network. And the pollinator pathway is managed in the Northeast here and by a board of directors. And we were all the first group that organized it from this Hudson-Housatonic Conservation Partnership. We manage the website, we create the educational materials, we connect with people interested in joining from other towns, and we give presentations like I'm giving today. But for everyone else who gets on the pollinator pathway, you manage your own pathway. It's managed at the town level by existing organizations. So you would organize, for example, in Cleveland, your own group of volunteers. You can do your own talks. You can do home visits. You can act as a fiscal sponsor. And then you make and manage your page, which is on the Pollinator Pathway website. Over these years, we've kind of taken a step back to figure out why this has been so successful. And this is kind of the overview of my talk today. And the reasons that we think this is working is because the pollinators, whether they be butterflies or bees, are charismatic characters, kind of like panda bears. They open doors, they start a conversation about protecting and restoring biodiversity at a level that people can understand. It's at a smaller scale, it's at a backyard scale, and people can understand that, and then they can see the impact of the action steps that they take. It's a very positive message. There's no finger wagging. We don't tell people to, pull out plants that are not necessarily natives, as long as they're not invasive. It's about just adding, it's accentuating, it's enhancing your gardens. We highlight the importance of keeping it simple and affordable. The message is simple, and there's not a lot of expense that goes into creating a pollinator pathway. And the Pollinator Pathway group, we've already worked on all the PDFs that you can print off from the website, so you don't even have to design them yourself. It's a decentralized, local control and grassroots organization. And it's free and it works, and every town adds its own flavor. And it really is an excuse for people to reach across boundaries and talk with each other, across town lines, and across state lines. The real reason that I think the overriding reason is that Pollinator Pathway offers a way to take action at home and to join a wave of others who are taking action. It's something positive to talk about, and it's something that small action steps make a big difference. In other words, if you plant it, they will come. If you put these native plants in your backyard, pollinators will show up. We also tapped into what is already there. There is an anxiety about sharp declines in bee and bird and butterfly populations that's already out there through the New York Times, through magazines and other newspapers. There's an undercurrent of concern that's been created. The anxiety's out there. People feel helpless and they don't know what to do. And the Pollinator Pathway just came along at the right time to give people things that they can do that will make a big difference. So the timing was, like I said before, a perfect storm for launching this. And again, you know, the dark news is, why are we doing this? The monarch populations are down. There's honeybee colony disorders, bumblebees are crashing. There's just bad news globally for these poor pollinators and insects in general. And when the insects populations are impacted, it affects the birds, and then it affects everything else in the food chain. What we've done through the use of pesticides and not using enough native plants is we've taken the bottom pieces out of the Jenga game. You know, the Jenga game where it's stacked up to the ceiling, that's our food chain. We've taken out the bottom pieces and the whole thing's tumbling down. What the Pollinator Pathway is trying to do is to put those pieces back, put that foundation back in, bring the native plants in, and stop using the pesticides. This is a great slide from Doug Tallamy. He's allowed me to use this. His slides are so beautiful. But he lined up the 6 reasons that insect populations are declining globally. And the point of this slide is to show that 5 of the 6 reasons, the 5 of the 6 causes are completely in our control to reverse. Stop using the pesticides. Stop the habitat loss. Start using native plants. Get those invasive species out of there, and then adjust your lighting, your night lights. Climate change is a big picture that really scares us and we feel helpless, but 5 of the 6 steps are definitely within our power to change. So the question remains, why can't insects and the biodiversity that depends on them be sustained in our parks and preserves? As a director of a land trust, I get this question all the time. You know, my land trust has 2,000 acres that we have preserved. There's 64 nature preserves with trails. Why isn't that enough for the insects and nature? And the reason it's not enough is because this is what it looks like. Our landscape is permanently fragmented. And so now it's up to us to weave it back together with pollinator pathways, with green corridors, reconnect the fragmentation. And this picture is kind of typifies why it has been so hard in the conservation arena to get land trusts to understand why it's important to connect the private properties, because people, land trusts will look at this and they'll say, well, you know, what are you going to do? That farm's always going to be there. That house is always going to be there. We can't connect the landscape. And E.O. Wilson and Doug Tallamy and others have said, yes, we can if we focus on the private properties. We focus on the yards, we focus on the farmlands, and we manage them in an ecologically balanced way. You can create connectors. And there's a great illustration that Doug Tallamy uses. And David Quammen is an author that came up with this illustration of comparing ecosystems to a Persian rug. Now, this is an example of what the world looked like maybe before humans. Our ecosystems were intact, they were connected, they were balanced. And then we came in and our population started to expand and we cut the rug up into pieces. Now that no longer looks like a Persian rug. And many of us throw our hands up and say, well, that rug is ruined. We can't use that. That looks terrible. And it's not functioning as a rug anymore. But what Doug Lemay and E.O. Wilson say are these fragments can be connected again. It may not look like the original rug. It may not completely function as an untouched ecosystem. But if we begin to create connective tissues in between in between the protected properties, we can recreate nature. And this is where the green corridors and the pollinator pathways come in. We are planting in between and creating stepping stones, in a sense, between the protected preserve. So this gives you a visual on what large corridors look like. So wildlife corridors, bird migratory flyways, healthy watersheds, these are big areas of movement, of water, of birds, of wildlife. And so this gives people the understanding of connecting the landscape. But what we had to do to get people to understand that they were a part of this connected landscape was to scale it down into the backyard setting. But we were trying to connect this landscape because what we're trying to do is get a movement across the landscape in the face of climate change to areas that are more resilient. And this illustration shows that when you have broader biodiversity and it's connected, you have a landscape that's going to be resistant to climate change. There are certain land areas, as it says, have higher capacity to host more species because of the geology and the shaping of the land. Of course, you've got wetlands, you've got highlands, you've got ridges, and these resilient sites will hold the most biodiversity no matter how the climates change. Maintaining connectivity to these sites allows species to naturally distribute themselves, and this keeps our region resilient. So this connectivity is what we're trying to do with the pollinator pathways and the green corridors. We want wildlife to be able to move to these resilient landscapes. And again, is a great illustration of the more biological diversity, the more life. When we have just plain lawns in our landscapes, we don't get an awful lot of diversity in the wildlife and birds that show up. But then we add maybe a little riparian area, add some groups of trees, and then we have a few more species that are showing up. And then up here, you get a healthier landscape. See, we're still there in farms. There's still maybe backyards in here, but we've added this connector pieces, the trees and the buffers and the native plant, which increases the diversity in our backyard. This is what we want in our landscape, and this is what we want in our backyards. So again, connecting open space and our backyards allows for a free flow of movement across the landscape from one place to another, from one nature preserve to another. So the pollinator pathway took that concept of large corridors and shrunk it down to the size of neighborhoods. The green shows our nature preserves. The blue are our homes. This is fragmentation. And it's not impossible to connect across there because this is how we create the corridors. We look to connect the landscape by having all of these homeowners change the way that they manage their landscape and become part of the pollinator pathway. It's a corridor of public and private properties that provide native plants, habitat, and nutrition for pollinators. Towns, municipalities, and property owners create these pesticide-free healthy yards and public spaces to allow for this flow across the landscape. And the pollinators themselves, again, are at a scale that people can understand. And people will say, wow, how far can a bee fly? Or how far can a butterfly go across the landscape? And, you know, some of these 500-foot, sweat bees can possibly just spend their life in your backyard, but others, like the monarchs, are moving across the landscape. And so there's a variety of distances that they can fly. And so this is why when your backyard's connected to the neighbor's backyard and to the next town, you can create this pathway that all of them need. So again, I'll emphasize the positive message, getting people to understand they can reconnect the landscape by making your property a stepping stone for a free flow of species. This is from Monarch Gardens. This is one of our favorite nonprofits. This is an example of a stepping stone. This property has native plants, grasses, and I'm sure no pesticides. They rethink their lawn, doing all the right things, and looks like it's connected to maybe what was an old farm or a tree farm. This is what we mean about connecting the landscape. The fragmented habitats, the wildlife and birds, insects can't get across. When our backyards are in the middle, we change the way our backyards are treated. We stop the pesticides, we plant the native plants, we reduce our lawn, we allow for this connected habitat or free flowing across the landscape. This is one of the most beautiful examples that I've seen. This is Rick Dark, who is an amazing landscape architect and author. This is his property. And to me, this is the perfect stepping stone because look, there's still a lawn. The lawn is the frame. It's not the whole picture. And if I were flying over the landscape, I would definitely stop there. Whether I was an insect, whether I was a bee or a bird, I would definitely stop there. So the messaging for the pollinator pathway and for my Aspetuck Green Corridor is very simple. It's the same messaging. 3 things: rethink your lawn, whether that means reducing the size, mowing less, using organic lawn care. Plant native plants, of course, goes without saying. They bring the pollinators and the birds, and they increase the biological diversity of your landscape. And avoid pesticides. As E.O. Wilson says, a world without insects is a world without people. So just completely not only avoid or reduce, but get rid of the pesticides altogether. And I'll go through each one of those briefly. Rethink your lawn. So these are some examples. This lawn itself is all clover. And I took this picture in the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican. And everyone else is taking pictures of the Sistine Chapel, and I'm taking pictures of the lawn. Except I said to my husband, it's not lawn, it's clover. The whole thing is clover. It's beautiful, it's green, it doesn't have to be watered. And I guess if it's good enough for the Pope, it's good enough for us to use clover in our lawns. This is a friend of mine who I went to her house and found that her husband had mowed the lawn around these islands. And I just love this concept of clover islands. It never really dawned on me until I saw her do this. And now I advocate for people to just mow around the clover, leave these islands, and they're full of activity, just buzzing with bees. And then of course, be creative, get rid of the lawn completely, make walkways, use sedges. There's a lot of beautiful things you can do without the lawn. And again, there's nothing wrong with the lawn as long as it's a moderate size and it's not drenched with toxins and pesticides. And of course, plant native plants. Number 2, this is one of Doug Tallamy's illustrations, which I just love. It shows that native plants are the source of all energy that supports life. It supports life for the herbivores, which the carnivores rely on. It supports the insects, which everything else that feeds on insects relies on. This is the food web. This is the chain of life, and native plants are the center point of it. And number 3 goes without saying, avoid the pesticides and herbicides. I don't want my children and my pets absorbing these toxins, and it's just completely unnecessary. I just hate to see these yellow signs on people's lawns. And the pollinator pathway, in addition to the simple message of those three things, works well because it's a scalable model. Any size garden will work. As small as container gardens, if you live in a condominium or an apartment, you can put pots on your porch or your balcony. And as a matter of fact, the original bee highway that was created in Oslo, Norway, started with containers and pots on the porches and balconies of apartment houses in Oslo. And that's what the pollinator pathway kind of emerged from. Pollinator gardens may be a little bit bigger in your backyard, demonstration sites, put them in front of your school library, your town hall. And then there's the big restoration sites that are, dozens of acres in size. Now, of course, the planning and the complexity and the cost increases as the size of the landscape increases. So if you want to start out in your town with container gardens in front of stores on Main Street with signs in it, that's the way to go. So we started to say that the pollinator pathway is the starter drug for biodiversity. It was a simple, small scale way for people to understand biodiversity. And once you planted natives in your backyard, these guys show up almost immediately. It's almost as if they follow you home from the nursery and they wait for you to put these in your backyard. And if your yard is safe enough for them to show up, it's safe enough for all insects, birds, mammals, pets, and our families. So once you get this showing up in your backyard, this becomes your addiction and they become your pollinators. And we don't want our neighbors spraying near our pollinators because we take a sense of pride and ownership in what we have in our backyards now. And strangely enough, COVID has really enhanced what we are seeing in our backyards because, we're home more and we're working from home. And we're looking out our windows and say, wow, I didn't know that red fox walked in front of my house every single day at 9 o'clock in the morning because I wasn't here to see it. So people have increased awareness about the nature that's around them. So before I go into the next section, I just wanted to show you that I keep pictures of, not pictures, but the actual oak leaves on my lamp on my desk to remind me that when my leaves look like Swiss cheese, then I have a really good biodiverse landscape. When my oak leaves fall off the trees and they don't look like Swiss cheese, then I would be really worried. This is an example, and as Doug Tallamy tells us, why oaks are the #1 tree for biodiversity, because they're the larval host to over 500 species of caterpillars and moths and butterflies. And this is why your leaves should look like this. And I know there was a time in our lives when we thought, oh my gosh, we have to spray. There's something wrong. There's something eating our leaves. Now we realize we have to have our leaves look like this. This is what creates biodiversity in our backyard. So now I'm just going to go over with you how to actually start a pollinator pathway in your town. These are 6 steps that we have seen work over and over again. They, of course, can be adapted to what your needs are. Maybe there's people on the call today who are somewhere down around number 3 already, or who already have a pollinator pathway. But they're pretty simple steps and they're fun. It's just a really positive and fun thing to do in your town. So #1 is convene your team. Look at your town and see, do you have local nurseries? Do you have a nature center? I'm sure you have conservation commissions, inland wetland organizations, advisory boards, garden clubs, master gardeners, watershed associations. These are all in your town and they become part of the team. If you have one person from each one of them, that's a team. So it's looking at your town through a different lens, through a conservation lens, and through organizing everybody together for a common cause. This was a team in New Jersey, in Montclair, New Jersey, and they went to towns next door and began to expand their team and get this whole group together to go on to the pollinator pathway. And it was a lot of fun for them. The second thing is plan your route. This is a really fun exercise. I find everybody likes to play with maps. If you can get big maps of your town and get your team together and look at your town from a 36,000 foot distance, like you're a drone. Look down at your town, see where the open spaces are, see where these corridors are. This is like a river corridor, protected landscapes. But make sure when you get your maps, you have the next door, the towns that surround you, because you're going to be connecting corridors in your mind or on paper across town lines, because pollinators and birds don't know our political boundary. We need to connect the people and the landscape across town lines and state lines. This is our meeting with the folks in New York. So we looked at a bigger area and began to connect the protected properties, the nature preserved, with the neighborhoods that are in between. So getting in a room together with other towns and meeting each other is amazing. And I know I'm the chair of the Conservation Commission in my town. And I know for years, our town didn't talk to the town next door, which is crazy. And it wasn't until the pollinator pathway started to emerge around Connecticut that the adjacent towns started to work together to protect land, because we were doing it for a reason that was bigger than ourselves. We share tools with each other, we share ideas, and you add your own flavor. So the pollinator pathway team, we're not telling you there's only one way to do it. You add your color and your flavor to your pollinator pathway. Holding a kickoff event is a lot of fun. It can be a lecture like this one. This was our very first kickoff lecture in Wilton in February of 2017. So this was 6 years ago in February. And we had people from multiple towns show up, and that was the catalyst. That was the launch of the pollinator pathway. This was in another town in Connecticut where they went to a nursery and people dressed up like bees. Well, actually they had the teenagers dressing up like bees, and had wine and cheese, and the nursery owner did a lecture on native plants for the whole group. So it connected across boundaries, and you built alliances, and people started to meet each other, and it was a great thing. Number 4, engage your community, your corporate partners, your town stakeholders, and your town staff in working with you. Get your Boy Scouts together, get your garden clubs together, have a plant sale. There are a lot of really nice, strong young people that work in the corporate parks that are in our communities, and they are looking for sustainability projects. Get them engaged in planting native plants, whether it's along riverways or in parks. And this is the group in New Jersey. And I love this picture because it's just, I'm going to look at this 10 years from now and say, oh, you remember COVID when we always had masks on? And I'm hoping 10 years from now, we don't have to wear masks. But everybody here's got their pollinator pathway signs, and they had a big event in the center of their town where they had already planted some really beautiful pollinator gardens. So it's a way for the communities to get together on something positive. Spread the word, number 5, whether that means through local newspapers or radios or podcasts, local blogs. Make sure that if you're going to launch your pollinator pathway, and this is my town, just before COVID hit, we launched our pollinator pathway, and make sure that you spread the word. These brochures are available, the blueprint for them The generic blueprint is available, and you can add your town name onto it. And you can make changes to the inside of it. But these are kind of nice tools to have if, when you launch your pollinator pathway. You just get the blueprint and you bring it to a printer and have them print it up for you. And then shared website, making sure you stay connected. Our pollinator pathway, it's pollinator-pathway.org. Our website is just a wealth of information. It's beautiful, it's fun. It allows each town to have its own page and contribute information. The events are listed under your town where you're going to have plant sales or whatever. The yard signs are available on the site to order. And that's the place where the handout tips for planting containers, garden and meadow, alternatives to pesticides, where to buy native, all of that is on that website. So you don't have to recreate the wheel, it exists already. And it's a resource that's open to everybody. These are some of the resources. Again, we mentioned the brochures, the logos for Pollinator Pathway. We just kind of like having a consistent logo so that people in Massachusetts will see this and say, oh, I saw that in Connecticut. What does that butterfly mean? And the logos, if you see the green area behind it, we started to do the logos in the shape of the town. So this town is shaped like this, and this town shaped like this. So you can do something like that just to make it a little bit different. And this emerged from our mapping, because when we were looking at the first pollinator pathway, when we said, oh gosh, that looks like antennas crisscrossing in the center of town. And from that crisscross emerged the butterfly. This is all on the website. Again, all of our PDFs are free. This Wildflowers for Pollinators Through the Seasons, we developed in Connecticut. Our queen bee, our state entomologist, came up with this list for wildflowers, trees, and shrubs. This shows a sequence of blooms from May to October. I would encourage you, whatever state you're in, to look up your agricultural experiment station and have your state entomologist come up with the best natives for your area. And then you can develop something like this for your state. All of this is, again, available on our resources page on Pollinator Pathway. These are some new ones that we just worked on. We just completed a pesticide brochure. And then there's a story map, which is kind of like a self-serve presentation you go through on your own, and it's a great teaching tool. Some towns, like our wonderful town of Newtown here, which needed an awful lot of healing, created a proclamation. And the first selectman signed the proclamation saying that the town of Newtown is a pollinator pathway town. Town of Newtown's on the pollinator pathway. Pledges and proclamations are also on the website. And here is the pledge, getting people to actually sign their address, their email, and their signature, saying that they're going to support and protect pollinators by adding native plants and refraining from the use of pesticides and herbicides. We have an electronic version of this also on the website. But this is how you get people's addresses and how you can put the butterflies on the map. And this is what the metal signs look like. We have small ones and big ones. They were designed to go on like mailbox posts or stake in the backyard. We'd love to see a lot more of these on people's lawns than those yellow pesticide squares. And this just shows how, if you go on the website, you pull up, there's Connecticut pathways, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. We have 9 states now. And then you click on the state and then you go to your town, and that's where we have all the information for each neighborhood, village, town. You all have your own pathway. And this is a profile of making your own pathway page on the website. This is Phillipstown, New York. They put their own team on the website, join the pathway, and they put their own narrative on their page. So of course, the pollinator pathway is a shared and evolving idea. It's organized by people who are maybe already doing this work or sensitive to it. And the ideas are taken from the work of Doug Tallamy and the Xerces Society. This is one of the best books. If you've not read this book, this is a great place to start. This is kind of our Bible for pollinator pathway. So organizing people together and listening to them moves them towards taking action. It's an invitation to show up for what matters for you and your community. And this is what I mean about let's see a lot more of these signs around. Imagine if this was all over the United States instead of these signs. It's an invitation to show up and take action steps that make a change, not only in your yard, but also in your community. So now I'm going to take a little deeper dive into biodiversity and show how we went from pollinator pathway to green corridor. So I use this map because it shows, this is like a 4-town area: Westport, Fairfield, Easton, Weston. All of these towns are on the pollinator pathway. And my land trust hired an ecologist to help us take a deeper dive into biodiversity and look at some of the areas that are riparian areas. So this map is designed around river areas that are coming down through the state. And this includes most of our protected lands in here. So by overlapping pollinator pathways and then taking this deeper dive, you're supercharging biodiversity in these places. So this is our map, for example. The green, these are our nature preserves. And as you can see up here where that resilient landscape is that we talked about, the wooded landscape with the different geography, that's up here. Down here is a lot more densely populated. We still have preserves scattered around, but these are the neighborhoods that we want to begin to encourage people to change what they do on their properties, because the green corridor is not only land protection, which is typically what land trusts do, but the green corridor is also land stewardship. It's 40,000 acres, that's this whole thing, 40,000 acres, overlaps 6 towns, and it helps to connect and heal the landscape, getting the private neighborhoods and private properties connected to the preserved properties. It's a way to test biodiversity. And one of the examples, see, if you look down the bottom here, you see the Haskins Preserve. This is one of our preserves that we started this project with Evan Abramson, who's the speaker after me. So I'm not going to talk too much about this, but Evan owns Landscape Interactions, and he worked with Dr. Robert Gagier, who's a bee ecologist, and they worked with us on one of our preserves, coming up with a 6 site pollinator habitat that includes a courtyard garden, a bee lawn, meadow, wetland garden, ecotone transition, which is between the woods and the lawn. And these are 6 different areas where Evan and Dr. Gagier did a baseline evaluation of what pollinators were there, specifically bees, what were there before we planted, and then we started to replant some significant pollinator plants on this landscape. And the science really informed the design of this, and the plans drove the results. So right now we're in the midst of this project. We're in the 2nd year. We had a big glitch because we found out that the Westport deer absolutely love native plants, and they ate everything down to the bottom. So we had to fence in to get these plants and trees and shrubs to a point where they could survive on their own. So we're still undertaking this project, and I'll let Evan talk more about this and other projects that he's doing to measure biodiversity in the corridor. And we realized and learned that 5% of our native plants make up 75% of the food that drives our food webs. So if we were going to try and get people to change what they do in their backyard, they had to put these keystone plants in their backyard. And what better way to do that than to create a native keystone plant sale, which we did in the middle of COVID in 2020. This was our very first plant sale, where we worked with a team at Connecticut NOFA, which is the Northeast Organic Farming Association, to collect native wild seeds, not plants, from certified sites. Brought the seed to organic farmers who grew out the seed crops. The seed savers harvested it, cleaned the seeds, went to nurseries to propagate native plants, and then came to our plant sale in flats like this. These are our ecotype, our ecotype seeds. So these are our local Eco 59 species, Joe Pyeweed and different asters. And this is how we plant the green corridor. This is, of course, Joe Pyeweed, which we love. And there's New York ironweed here. These are founders plots, which are grown out on farms, just like you would grow crops, except they are native plants. So before we had a plant sale, we had to make sure that we had plants to sell, and that's what triggered the Ecotype project. So the Ecotype project was a project that emerged from the pollinator pathway in the green corridor. Because we didn't have native plants, we had to start from scratch. So the plant sales, I finished 6 of them. These are specific to my green corridor, my Aspetuck Land Trust. It's our fundraiser, and we didn't start it out as a fundraiser, but it turned into it because it's been so popular. In the last 6 years, we've sold 34,000 native plants, trees, and shrubs that have gone out into the green corridor and beyond. This is the tool, this is the action step to get people to bring these into their yards, which are stepping stones for native plants. And we helped people by designing some gardens. This is, one of the small gardens. This is a full flat of 32 plugs. People buy the flat for like $100, and we give them the plan, and they plant it, and they get the garden, and we list the pollinators that will show up in this garden. Then we went the next step and started looking at layers. So we put together hedgerow kits that included shrubs, perennials, and trees. So somebody could come in and buy like a whole kit, cost like $400, and it would have 2 trees and shrubs. But this is how to really supercharge or increase the biodiversity in a rapid way. And these are some of the other plants. This, for example, was a half flat, so 16 plugs. This is the 32 plug. But we give all the information that you need to bring a native garden into your backyard. And this is our plant sale 2020, 2021, 2022. It has increased consistently 20% every year in terms of the sales and the volume of plants and customers as well. So we look like a bunch of Frito Banditos with our masks on, but it all through COVID, this has been a socially acceptable way to raise money and get those native plants out into the landscape. And the other thing that we've done is to begin to partner with landscape designers, landscape architects. We have built really strong relationships with Planet Wild and Growing Solutions and Mow Green, which is a green mowing company. And we put their information on our Aspetuck website because we always get questions from people about who can I hire to plant this stuff in my backyard. For people who are not do-it-yourselfers, we go out and create partnerships with landscape designers in our region. So this way we have a suite of, not the traditional mow and blow guys. We have the people who really want to increase biodiversity using native plants. And something to keep in mind too, there's always unexpected partners out there. Here in Connecticut, we have a partnership with the Connecticut Department of Transportation. It's not a perfect partnership, but they are trying, and they have expanded to, I think they have about 111 sites now throughout the state where they have demonstration gardens on our highways, using native grasses and native plants and trees. This again was driven by that pollinator protection law because it was a mandate from the state that the DOT had to do this, and they're doing it, which is great. We have another unexpected partner with our water company, proving that native plants don't need as much water as the non-native gardens that we're so used to soaking with water. And recently you've seen all of these wonderful apps that are online, whether it's Seek or Merlin for birds. Here's Beecology. Here's the Wild Seed Project. Everyone out there is trying to develop, oops, excuse me, it's my timer. Everyone out here is trying to develop tools that help you to measure the improvements in biodiversity. You can't make changes if you don't measure. If you don't do a baseline, you can't see that you're improving biodiversity. So all of these tools are out here to help you assess and manage your native plants and see who's showing up. And this was a final slide here. This was a recent article that just came out. It validates the work that we're all doing, that there's an urban nexus of social and ecological relationships in wildlife gardening. What we're doing is not only having an impact on wildlife, but it's having an impact on our society and the way we feel about each other and ourselves. It's a great article. So it's Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. So that is the end of my talk. I just wanted people to know that the secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, no finger wagging, but on building the new. And this was just a great excerpt I saw about courage and how this group of people, we all didn't know each other, and now we're all close friends because the world looks to leaders to model courage. When your passion overtakes your fear, courage emerges. Courage is acting in the face of fear, standing up to the truth, being willing to take a risk, and actively making a difference. So I thank everybody today. It's now up to you to explore and inspire in your own backyards. And feel free to reach out to me anytime via email, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. So thanks for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mel. It was a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Great topic. I am going to shoot a couple questions to you since we have a little bit of time before Evan's talk.
Okay.
There was quite a bit of questions around how you persuaded or convinced people to stop using pesticides.
Oh gosh, that's always a challenge. And we actually, if you look on our website, believe it or not, there is a 1 or 2 page PDF on how to talk to your neighbor. And again, it's just taking these positive steps and engaging them, having them come over and, say, hey, I've got monarch caterpillars on you want to come see my monarch caterpillars? And I absolutely have done it with pesticide companies too. I go across the street and I grab them and say, come here, I want to show you something. And sometimes the pesticide guys don't even know what the monarch caterpillar looks like. They'll say to me, oh, I didn't know that. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys are killing these things and you don't know what they look like. But just engaging them and having them see what's in their backyard and say, let's go to your backyard and see if you have any of this stuff. If they truly understand, I think most people don't understand when they do these perimeter sprays for ticks and mosquitoes, that they are bringing an entire ecosystem to its knees. Those edge habitats are so important for birds, and you're killing thousands of other species besides the ticks and mosquitoes. So those things just really have a big impact, and you won't see as many birds in your backyard if you're using those sprays. So again, no finger wagging, just invite them over and show them your caterpillars. Sure.
Okay, so 2 more really quick. How do you interact with Homegrown National Park?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. We I am a huge Doug Tallamy fan. I am actually a stalker of his. So wherever I see him speaking, I will listen to him and I follow him. We don't necessarily interact in any way. We're just kind of doing the same thing in a sense. We're not necessarily national, and they're a national organization, but we follow the world according to Tallamy. So whatever Homegrown National Park's asking you to do is what Pollinator Pathway is asking you to do. So it's the same messaging.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mel. It's 2 o'clock, so we're going to keep moving on. And if we didn't get to your questions, we promise that we'll get to them following up after the session today.
Okay, great. Nice meeting everybody, even though I didn't see you, but nice meeting
you. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to get going here. It's my pleasure to introduce Evan Abramson. Evan is founder and principal of Landscape Interactions. He will be presenting Designing Landscapes and Corridors to Support Biodiversity and Climate Resilience. Welcome, Evan.
Thanks so much. I guess I'll get started here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. Building off of what Mel was talking about, I'm going to go a little deeper into the scientific and ecological reasons behind pollinator habitat, why it's so important, and why it is a building block for biodiversity. So just a little bit of background. I'm a landscape planner and designer. My company does work across the Northeast and increasingly in different parts of the US. And I'm gonna take you guys on a little journey where we'll look at the science behind pollinator habitat design and restoration, how it's linked to other issues regarding climate change and biodiversity loss, as well as carbon sequestration. And then I'll show you some examples of some of our work that have attempted to address these problems. So as many of you probably know, we're living in a new time on the planet where humans have the most impact on the earth. And this is a new geological epoch that is called the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is defined by rising carbon emissions, sea level rise, as well as the global mass extinction of species and the transformation of land across the planet, primarily as a result of human development, including large, widespread industrial agriculture. And currently, as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet, including plants and animals, are headed toward extinction by the middle of this century. What this means is it's potentially a collapse of nature. 1 million species are threatened with extinction globally, including half of the native bee species in North America. And bees, as well as all insects, are essential for ecosystems, not just as pollinators, but also as food for other creatures. Most insects could vanish within a century at the current rate of decline. And the main reason for this is loss of habitat. It's the conversion of natural spaces into things other than nature, such as cities and suburbs, large farms. And as one scientist put it, we are sleepwalking towards the edge of a cliff. If we don't do something soon, we really won't have a way to turn back. It's not just insects that are impacted. The impacts are moving across ecosystems. They're moving across trophic levels. And a study that came out just 2.5 years ago found that North America has lost 3 billion birds since 1970, which is over 1 in 4 birds. Again, the main reason is loss of habitat. So you can see the impact moving across different animal groups. The 5 main threats to global biodiversity, according to the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, are changes in land and sea use, which is basically loss of habitat, development of nature, exploitation of natural resources, climate change, pollution, and invasive species. So these are all the main issues that we're also facing in the United States. And these are the factors that are affecting loss of pollinators and loss of wildlife in general. But in order to solve the climate crisis, you also have to look at the biodiversity crisis, because connected and diverse ecosystems actually help stabilize the climate and have a better chance at thriving and surviving in a world that's affected by rising emissions. So rather than being framed as a victim of climate change, biodiversity is actually a key ally in dealing with climate change and making more climate resilient landscapes. Looking at the Midwest a bit, where some of you are based, US agriculture accounts for over 10% of the country's total emissions. And this is mainly as a result of tillage for cropland expansion. And a 2019 study found that as much carbon is put into the air annually in the US as a result of tillage as 31 million cars. And another study in 2018 found that if we could conserve our grasslands, which include our prairies in the US, we could actually prevent almost 3 times as much carbon emissions as conserving forests. And just as a comparison, while obviously the Amazon basin has been severely logged in the past decades, only 20% of the Amazon has been lost, whereas half of all temperate grasslands in the world have been lost. Most carbon stored in the earth is actually stored in the soil, not above ground, as some people may believe. And this graphic here breaks it down in terms of how many tons of carbon per hectare. So wetlands hold the most carbon on the planet. They're holding about 643 tons of carbon below ground. Second is temperate grasslands. In terms of where we live, 236 tons of carbon below ground compared to just 7 tons above ground. And that's followed by temperate forests. So we don't really have boreal forests in the United States. I mean, we do have them in Alaska, but otherwise in the lower 48, that doesn't exist. But these 3 areas that I've circled are really our main opportunities in the US for storing carbon. You can see that grasslands are quite significant. They far outweigh forests in terms of below ground carbon storage, and soil holds twice as much carbon as the what is above ground and animals combined. In terms of climate change projections, obviously wildfires are a big issue, as we can see what's been going on, particularly in the Intermountain West. Now, unlike forests, when grasslands go up in fire, they still hold most of their carbon below ground, because the biomass is stored below the soil. So depending upon where you live and what kind of a landscape you're surrounded by, it might actually be a better climate preparedness scenario to build more resilient grasslands, which includes meadows and flowering grassland landscapes. Because if you do experience wildfire, that carbon will be stored underground. It won't go up with the wood. And this image here is showing Indian grass, which is one of our native warm season grasses. And you can see how the root system is so big compared to what's above ground. This diagram here shows a lot of the common plants that you would find in a grassland or prairie environment. So you've got here on the left, Kentucky bluegrass. That's what's in your typical lawns. And that's only about 2 inches below the soil. Over here, this is heath aster. It's one of our native asters. It's got roots that go down 8 to 9 feet below the ground. This is switchgrass, and this is little bluestem. So these are a lot of the species that we work with in the Northeast as well in designing pollinator habitat. Our sort of hypothesis here is that if we want to survive the next century and build a more resilient landscape and help protect species against becoming extinct, to help stave off biodiversity loss and build more climate resilient landscapes, our main opportunities are really with farms, conservation properties, urban and suburban parcels, and rural communities and large-scale solar arrays. These are our opportunities for designing and restoring biodiverse, climate-resilient landscapes by focusing specifically on native plants, and more specifically, the native plants that support the native pollinators that are at risk. So in all of our work at Landscape Interactions, we do a review of the literature. We look at historical observations of pollinator species and then contemporary observations. We figure out which species are at risk of becoming locally extinct, and then which plants support them. And by incorporating those plants into a design or into a plan, you're able to support the entire food web. And what happens down here at the pollination scale is what affects everything else in the food web, including humans. So why are pollinators so important? They're primarily insects that fertilize plants, producing seeds and fruit. And over 80% of the world's flowering plants depend upon pollinators for reproduction. So if the pollinators aren't there, the plants can't create more seeds and they can't reproduce. They can't expand across the landscape. Bees alone pollinate nearly half of the food crops in Massachusetts, as well as a third of the food grown in the United States. And most terrestrial ecosystems depend upon pollinators, either on the plant side or on the animal side. And about 15% of the native bee species in the Northeast are actually pollen specialists, meaning that they only pollinate plants from a particular genus or family. And that's really the case across the United States. I think in the West, it might be closer to 20% or 25% of the plants, but still the ratio is pretty high. So when we're designing a landscape, we're really looking at what are the needs of a pollinator and then designing from there, rather than looking first at what will be, the best for a person. People are important. Obviously, people live on these landscapes and use them, but aesthetics sort of come second to the needs of the creatures. And we feel like both of those goals can be addressed simultaneously. So there's about 4,000 native bee species in the US. About 400 of them live in the Northeast. Native bees do the vast majority of pollination. A global study looked at 41 different food crops across the entire planet, and they actually found that wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit. The average distance that a native bee flies from its nest is only between 200 and 1,800 feet. 70% of native bees live below ground. Most live alone. They don't have colonies. And they require habitats like bare exposed ground in the sun, dry ground, twigs, dead trees, and snags, as well as abandoned rodent burrows. This here is from one of our design projects, and it's looking at the distance between our different sites. This was a pollinator corridor project that we designed, and how far a different bee species would travel from site to site. So you can see that you really have to have sites pretty close together if you want to have that connectivity. Having one project or one garden installed, every half mile is not really going to allow most pollinator species to get from place to place, unfortunately. Depending upon the site, where it's located and what kind of landscape it is, we will, look at different pollinator species to target. So, just an example of other significant pollinators besides native bees, you've got the ruby-throated hummingbird. It's not at risk, but it's about as adept a pollinator as a honeybee, and it requires trees, shrubs, and vines for shelter and tubular flowers for foraging. The Aphrodite fritillary is an example of one of the many butterfly species that's increasingly at risk of local extinction here in the Northeast. They only lay their eggs on native violets. So if you don't have native violets, you won't be able to support this species. The monarch butterfly, many people are aware, it's got about an 81% population decline globally, and it only lays its eggs on milkweed. The Dion skipper is another example of a more specialized butterfly. It's very much at risk in the Northeast, and it only inhabits wetlands and wet meadows. It only lays its eggs on sedges. Honeybee, collapse has been a major issue that a lot of people have talked about. It's definitely been something that has helped to shine a spotlight on pollinators in general. But I think it's important to recognize that honeybees are not really in need of our help anymore. Their populations are now stabilized. So between 1980 and 2005, half the honeybee colonies in the US collapsed. So we went from 4.5 million to 2.25 million. But then since then, the amount of colonies has actually gone up and even stabilized. So right now, honeybees are stable. They are not at risk of extinction. They are not at risk of, dying off, so to speak. They are getting a lot of support, mostly from farmers and different agricultural organizations. But in the last decade, we've really seen a huge decline in wild bees. And as I mentioned earlier, wild insects and wild bees in particular are much more important for not only terrestrial ecosystems across the planet, but also our food systems. They're more important pollinators for major food crops. And in the United States, between 2010 and 2015, we lost nearly a quarter of our wild bees. This map here is showing the areas in yellow are the parts of the United States that had the lowest wild bee abundance during that period. Now, this next map is showing you estimated agricultural use of just one type of neonicotinoid pesticide in the US. And you can see that the maps are almost exactly the same. So the areas of the US that have the most neonicotinoid pesticide use are also the areas that have the lowest wild bee abundance. And it's notable that neonicotinoids are banned in the European Union. They're essentially a bee-killing pesticide. They also kill a lot of other insects. And more recent studies have shown significant harm to mammals, as well as birds, butterflies, and freshwater invertebrates. As I mentioned, native bees are really important, not just for ecosystems, but for our food systems. And you can see here that bumbus, which are bumblebees, pollinate nearly every major food crop. And they're the only native bee group that pollinates tomatoes and eggplants. According to the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, 90% of the world's food supply comes from just about 100 crop species, and 71 of those crops rely on bees for pollination. So that equates to 64% of the global food supply depends on bees. And it's 270 species of wild bees that do the bulk of this work. And that's according to the UN. So if we don't have wild bees, we won't have a stable global food supply. We really can't work around this with honeybees or even mechanized bees that do pollination, like robots, which is something that's being developed. We really need wild bees. This is a list of various peer-reviewed journals that have studied the impact of honeybees on wild bees and other wild insects. And the consensus is that honeybees harm wild pollinators and wild insects essentially by taking away pollen and nectar that they need in order to survive. So if you want to save the pollinators, if you want to save the bees, you're not going to do that by raising honeybees. Raising honeybees to save the bees is equivalent to raising chickens to save the birds. As I mentioned, our work is very much focused on which pollinators are in decline and how can we plant the things that they need to survive? How can we bring back those plants on the landscape? And so that's really what I'm talking about with this idea of beyond pollinator friendly. So if you look at this video here, this is showing you a native medium-tongued bumblebee, Bombus vagans, forcing its way into a bottle gentian flower, which is a native wetland flower, in order to obtain the nectar reward. The nectar is stored at the base of the flower. Now, this is an example of a specialized relationship. The bottle gentian can only be opened physically by a bumblebee. Other bees are too small. Only a medium and long-tongued bumblebee would have a long enough organ to be able to reach the nectar at the bottom of the flower. When it drinks the nectar, it rubs up against the pollen. And because the reward is so good, it goes and looks for another flower of the same species. This is what's known as floral constancy. It's like a reliable source of pollination for the flower. So that's a delicate balance. That's an evolutionary relationship that goes back millions of years, way before the arrival of humans to North America. So if there's no long or medium-tongued bumblebees around, which is increasingly what's happening in our landscapes, that flower will not be able to reproduce, and it will eventually become extinct from that property or even that region. So this is an example of what we're trying to prevent from happening by focusing our plant lists and our designs on the species that need the most help, essentially. So that is really the difference between diversity and abundance. You could have the best pollinator garden in the world, and it could be filled with bees, but if they're all the common eastern bumblebee and honeybees, well, that's not a diverse landscape, and that landscape is not going to be resilient. It's not resilient to climate change, and it's not resilient in terms of what it's doing to support other wildlife or other life on the planet. So just to give an example, this map here is looking at Massachusetts, where we have the most data, and it's comparing historical to current observations. So it's basically comparing observations from 1960 to 2000, the year 2000, and then observations from 2001 to 2020. And what we're finding is that whether you're in the high elevation areas of the state or the low elevation areas of the state, which are depicted here in this map, we're basically moving towards a very homogeneous landscape where historically in gold, in low elevation areas, there were about 9 different bumblebee species that were found at very high numbers, and they were able to be observed throughout the areas of the map that are here in beige. Currently, if you look at these graphs in green, we've really just got one species that's majorly being seen, which is the common eastern bumblebee, and then about 3 or 4 other species which are seen in extremely low numbers. If you look at the high elevation areas, which are the areas in darker orange and green, you can see that historically there were 3 species that were found in very high numbers, and then another 4 or 5 species that were historically found in low numbers. Nowadays, there's basically 2 species that are being found in high numbers, and then 4 species being found in low numbers, and their numbers are much lower than historical. So increasingly, landscapes are becoming homogenized, where the plants are missing, and then the pollinators are missing. And that's the difference between diversity and abundance. And then just to give another example, in New York State, a recent survey, this is the first state in the US to do a statewide assessment of pollinators. And what they found was that 24% of native bee species in New York were at risk of local extinction, and 11% were already gone from the state. They were extirpated. And between 38 and 60% of native bees, flies, beetles, and moths are also extirpated from the state or at risk. So that's a huge number. That's over half of the native pollinators may no longer be found in New York. And other states, unfortunately, don't even have such assessments. So the takeaway is what one species wants or needs, whether it's for pollen, nectar, or for host plant, is not the same for every other species. You have to be more specific in what you're planting. You can also see the impact, not just in pollinators, but in birds. And just to talk briefly about Doug Tallamy's work, his study looking at suburban yards in the Washington, D.C. area found that if at least 70% of the landscape's total biomass, which is like the total weight of the plants, was not native, then the common Carolina chickadee, which is not even an endangered species, was not able to have enough food to rear its young. So just imagine what the impact of that would be on more specialized bird species that might have more particular habitat requirements. The takeaway is that native plants are critical, not just for birds, but all wildlife, and especially the species that are at risk of extinction. Essentially, diversity is resilience. If you have more diverse plants on a landscape, you're going to have more diverse animals, and that's going to mean that the food web is more supported. If something happens, like a wildfire, a drought, a flood, some sort of disaster, a big knockdown of a lot of trees due to wind, you're going to have more of a chance of that landscape bouncing back if it's got more diversity. And that's really what we're trying to do here. And that diversity is best created by looking first at pollinators and what they need. You can also find a mirror image of the pollinator decline in the plant decline. And, New England, which has really good records going back to the 1700s, currently about a quarter of our native plant species are either locally imperiled, gone, they're no longer found in the region, or they're regionally or globally imperiled. And another interesting study compared the native flora of Concord, Massachusetts, and they looked at observations dating from the time of Henry David Thoreau to contemporary, and they found that 27% of the species were no longer there. Another important study in 2020, which came out of the University of New Hampshire, found that 94% of plant pollinator networks across northern New England were gone. And their conclusion to that was that conservation efforts should be focused specifically on habitat restoration for declining wild bee and plant species. So unfortunately, not just any native plant is going to be good enough. If you really want to help prevent this species loss, you have to be more specific in what you're planting. You have to look at the specific needs of these declining bee and other pollinator species. So here's some case studies of some of our work and how we're attempting to address these issues. Farming for Biodiversity is a project we did in partnership with a working farm on Martha's Vineyard. And the design is essentially created specifically for the farm, but also meant to be replicated on farms across coastal New England and even New York State. So with any of our projects, we look at the context, what are the conditions of the site, and what are the goals and what are the needs of the landowner. And what we found with Island Grown Farm, our partner for this project, was that they had a lot of opportunities for habitat on their landscape, and that the type of landscape they had as far as the soils, where they're located here in the center of Martha's Vineyard, they're sort of a microcosm for the island as a whole. One thing about Martha's Vineyard that's really important is it's one of the last places on the planet that has intact coastal grasslands. And coastal grasslands are really important for a wide range of native moths, native butterflies, and native bees. A lot of those species are no longer found in other parts of the United States, but they're still found in decent numbers. So it's essentially a refugia for these species. But one of the biggest threats is land use. And comparing this map here of 1971 to 2016, you can see that conserved land, undeveloped land, which is in green, and then developed land, which is over here in gray, it's a huge threat. And between 1971 and 2016, undeveloped land went from, developed land in Martha's Vineyard went from 11% to 40%. So it quadrupled. And during the same 50-year period, farmland was reduced from 4% to 2%. So one of our goals with the project was not only to create this model for a biodiverse farm, but also to help people obtain these plants on their own properties. And this here is Mary Sage Napolitan. She's our partner on the project. She's the regenerative land manager at Island Grown Farm. And she actually grew about a third of the plants that were included in our design during the first year. So this is not, something that's very complicated. We basically collected seeds in the wild, and we ordered some seeds from nurseries, and we potted them up and grew them out. We also did a pretty extensive literature review in order to actually determine what are the plants that we should be planting on Martha's Vineyard or other parts of the coastal Northeast, and how do we decide which plants to use? Well, the way that we did that was we reviewed a couple of really important studies that looked at moth decline since the 1970s. They looked at butterfly decline since the 1990s. They looked at bee declines. And what we ended up coming up with was a pretty amazing plant list. This here is our design for the project. As I mentioned, this is a working farm. So our design consisted of 8 sort of opportunities. We had field borders, which are herbaceous perennial vegetation in between rows of vegetable and fruit crops. We had hedgerows, which many of you are probably familiar with, sort of a mix of shrubs, trees, flowers, grasses, and sedges that go, in this case, they went along the tractor roads on the farm. Then we also created a wet meadow area, a shaded meadow area, a very well-draining dry oak savanna meadow with some shrub and tree plantings. We also came up with a seed mix for grazing livestock that's comprised entirely of native vegetation. We did some orchard plantings underneath the existing fruit and nut trees, and a mesic full sun meadow mix. This is the list of pollinators that were supported by the project. We targeted nearly 30 native bee species. A lot of them are specialized on these very sandy soils that are found in that part of the world. We targeted about 15 butterflies in about 15 months. And this is an example of what the design looked like. So looking at the hedgerow, we created a scalable, replicable design that runs about 50 feet by 12 feet. So essentially, depending upon how long you need it to be, you just repeat it. And this is an example of the layout. So they were doing hedgerows that were about 600 or 700 feet long going across the entire farm. So they would just repeat the hedgerow, anywhere from 12 to 14 times. And that makes planting really easily because you're basically putting the same thing every 50 feet. In the example of the orchard understory, it was pretty similar, but we just chose a different group of species that were more comfortable with a shaded environment. And then this would be the layout every 40 feet. And this was our design for the field border, which also repeats every 50 feet. We also, with all of our projects, include pretty specific specs for bee nesting habitat. That's something that's oftentimes overlooked. And essentially, most native bee species, about 70% of native bee species nest underground. So if you can just create areas that are in full sun with well-draining soil and keep those areas clear, free and clear of vegetation, basically keep them as like dirt, you're going to allow bees to nest underground. And so what we recommend is excavating the top 4 inches of soil and replacing it with half sand, half topsoil, and just basically weeding it and keeping it vegetation free. And you can install the nesting strips in between planted areas so that some native bee species like to nest at the base of, for example, warm season grasses. So they'll find that. This was our plant list for the different areas I was just showing you. So just to give an example, with the hedgerow, we had every 50 feet, one beech plum, which is a native plum, one scrub oak, one prairie willow, and one meadow willow. We had 4 yellow wild indigo, 4 northern bush honeysuckle, 1 shrubby St. John's wort, native roses, native raspberries, spirea, which is meadowsweet, native low bush blueberry. We had for grasses, little blue stem. For flowers, butterfly milkweed, purple Joe pieweed, which is shade tolerant and doesn't need very wet conditions. We had native bush clover, bee balm, beard tongue, goldenrod, aster, and goat's rue, which is Tephrosia virginiana. And then for the field border, it was a little different. We didn't have the woody species, but we had more taller grasses. So for example, we had big blue stem and switchgrass, and then a different mix of flowers, including purple giant hyssop, common milkweed, showy tick trefoil, hollow Joe pieweed, geranium, blazing star, etc. This design, as well as all of our designs that I'm going to show you today, are available for free download on our website. So if you're having trouble reading the plant list and you want to, look at this on your own computer, you can go to landscapeinteractions.com/projects and check these out. This here is a section of the hedgerow. So it's a scaled tool showing you basically what it would look like on the ground. And so you can see in relation to a tractor or a person, it wasn't super tall. One of the goals of the farmers was that the hedgerows would not shade their vegetable crops. So we selected species that don't grow to be above 10 feet. And then what we did here was we looked at, we isolated different plants from the hedgerow and basically just talked about which pollinators they support. So in this case, we have the scrub oak. It's a host plant for numerous butterflies and moths, including 3 at-risk butterfly species that are found in Martha's Vineyard. The Horace's dusky wing, the white M hairstreak, and the oak hairstreak. And then just like as a comparison, you have down here the prairie willow. That's a critical plant. Willows, native willows, I can't overemphasize the importance of them. They should be on any landscape that's trying to do pollinator habitat, we absolutely need native willows. They're one of the first plants that provides pollen in the spring. If you plant male willows, they'll provide pollen and nectar, and it supports numerous at-risk bees, including many andrinas. It also supports many of the bumblebees, many of the lasioglossums, and even some of the mason bees use it. It's also a host plant for the dreamy dusky wing, and on, etc. This rendering here is looking at what the design would look like after it's installed. So you can see here that this is the field border. This is what the perennial vegetation that's not woody would look like next to a planted field of garlic on the left, with a path in the middle, and then the grazing mix on the right. And in the case of this farm, they have sheep moving through the landscape every year. So we designed specifically for sheep. And we also have a really comprehensive plant list for this project that you can download on our projects page. And it includes every plant, what type of soil, how much sun it needs, how big it is, what color its flowers are, and then which bees, butterflies, or moths it supports. For site preparation, we also have pretty detailed guidelines for this project as well as our other projects on our website. And best management practices, as well as a list of nurseries and seed suppliers. And we get a lot of our seeds from the Midwest, especially from Prairie Moon Nursery in Minnesota. The Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan was a project we did in Lincoln, Massachusetts, that looked at how to create a corridor across the town. And so what we had with the project were a couple of design sites, specific sites that we created designs for, and then we made opportunities for replicating them across the entire municipality. So our design sites are here in purple. You can see here, and the sites that are in lighter purple are private properties in the town that bought plants that were featured in our design. So similar to what Mel was talking about with their planting kits that they're using at the Aspetuck Land Trust, we also partnered with the local land trust in Lincoln, Massachusetts, to create planting kits that were based specifically on our designs. So for each design, the plant list was different. One of our sites was a wet site. One of our sites was a 8-acre sheep pasture. One of our sites was a very small series of gardens outside a school. And one of them was a meadow with a woodland edge. So for each plant list, they created a planting kit. People purchased it and they installed them on these sites. So here on this map on the right, you can see that within just the first year of the project, if you just put a 500-foot buffer on each of these properties, which represents the average range that a native bee would fly from its nest, these are all the opportunities for replication across the town. So with just a few more sites added, you'd actually have a corridor across the entire town of Lincoln, Massachusetts. As I mentioned, we had 4 toolkit sites for the project. Now I'll show you them and talk a little bit about how we did that. So our first site, it was called People for Pollinators. It was essentially a combination of a meadow and a woodland. This is our design for the project. Initially, the project consisted of just a seed mix that was broadcast within this rectangular area. And they didn't really have a path system for the site. They also notably didn't have any trees or shrubs planted, or not even really any native grasses. So the site was just native flowers. So as I mentioned earlier, if you want to support species of concern, and if you want to have a biodiverse landscape, you need to have a mix of things that are going to support the wide range of species in that area. And what that essentially means is you're going to need to have shrubs or trees or both that are providing pollen at the beginning of the spring. You're going to need to have host plants. You know, most butterflies and moths lay their eggs actually on trees and shrubs, not on flowers or grasses, although some do. And so you need to have that. And then you want to have pollen and nectar throughout the season. So from March or April all the way until September, October, November. So that's what we did for this site. We took a pretty limited meadow area and expanded it to include a woodland edge, as well as a path system that wound throughout the property. The second site, it was an 8-acre field, beautiful field, but it was basically all entire cool season grasses, like no native flowers and pretty much no native grasses. It had some trees, but they were mostly, typical species that you'd find, not really providing a lot of diversity. So what we recommended with this site was actually to do prescribed burning to restore the site to more of a native grassland landscape. And then after a few burns, to seed it with some seed mixes and do selective planting. So these are the different ecological analysis that we did for the site. We did an analysis of slopes and drainage, how water moves across the site, the type of soils that it has, and the amount of light that it gets throughout the year. And essentially what we concluded was that it needed to be burned. At the scale of the landscape, it was too expensive to smother it with black plastic, and the land trust did not want to use herbicides. They have a ban on herbicides, so we couldn't use that to restore it to a native community. And so we actually were able to partner with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and get a grant to burn the site. And this site has actually been burned twice since we finished our plan. This was a picture of the site after the first burn. So it did a pretty good job of knocking things back. And after the second burn, which occurred last year, they actually began to seed the site with the seed mix that we created. The third site in Lincoln was a wet meadow site, and it actually had a lot of native plant diversity. So our recommendation for the site was essentially to manipulate it by changing the mowing schedules and to do some selective planting and seeding. So they didn't really have to do huge structural changes to the site. Then after all these designs were created, the next question is, how do you make something that homeowners can take home and do on their own properties? So we created a series of maps in Lincoln that showed each of these different designs and then where in the town you could replicate them. So depending upon the conditions of your property, you might find that your property is yellow. In that case, you would replicate the first design I showed you, the Meadow and Woodland Toolkit. If your property highlights as gold, then you would be best suited to replicate the second design, the Pasture Restoration Project, the Old Field Toolkit. And if your site shows up as green, the Wet Meadow Toolkit. And in the case of some properties, they actually showed up in more than one because the property might contain a mix of conditions. It might contain some wetlands and some open fields, for example. So it's sort of a menu of options with a roadmap for how to replicate across the town. And you can see here on this map on the left that if just those properties that were within 500 feet of one of our prior existing sites were to implement one of the designs, we would already have a corridor across the entire town with opportunities for pollinators to move across the entire community. And these are some images of the different designs being installed the first year after the project. So they did a mix of volunteer labor and some AmeriCorps, students that were in for the summer, and they basically were able to start installing within the first year. This project, Pollinate Northampton, was an example of how we did a corridor project without actually creating site-specific landscapes. So what we did was we created a series of designs that were based on common landscape typologies. What are the types of conditions you would find in this particular city that most people have on their properties? So we created a sun garden toolkit, which was essentially imagining 1,000 square feet in full sun, dry to medium soils. What do you plant? And then we have a specific plant list with an arrangement for those plants that people can use. We did the same for a shaded area that was imagined to be 800 square feet. And then we also did a design for the sidewalk strip, the area between the sidewalk and a road that's usually between people's driveways. That contained a list of species that were all drought tolerant, salt tolerant. We also created, a wet garden and a lawn toolkit for that project. And again, you can download that on our website, landscapeinteractions.com/projects. Pollinate Now is a new project that we're working on in New York State. It's actually the largest pollinator corridor project in the country. It includes 50 towns and cities, which are spread across 4 subwatersheds of the Hudson River estuary. So the Hudson River estuary goes all the way from Battery Park at the very southern tip of Manhattan, all the way up to Troy, New York, which is just past Albany. And this map here is showing you the entire watershed of the Hudson River estuary. Our focus area for this project are these 4 sub-watersheds of the Hudson River that are highlighted in magenta. So we partnered with a local nonprofit, and we created 4 different designs that represent, again, common landscape typologies that you'd find in that area. And it involved over 50 towns and cities. These are our focus sub-watersheds. So we have one property that's located in Red Hook, New York. It's located on the campus of Bard College, and it previously was a 14-acre cornfield. So the entire field was Roundup Ready corn that had just been grown for decades. The second site is a 200-acre privately owned conservation property. Third is a small 1/3 of an acre urban site located in Kingston, New York. And it is a YWCA, so it serves women and children with things like daycare and community support. And the 4th site is a riparian site. It's actually located on the banks of the Wallkill River in Gardner, New York, and it floods on average every 5 to 10 years due to, climate change impacts. The site is highly vulnerable to flooding. So for each of these sites, we are currently working on a specific design. And the idea is that each of these designs will be able to be replicated, not just across these towns and cities, but across the entire watersheds that you see here in this map. And in order to demonstrate the impact of the project, we surveyed each of these sites this past summer 4 times, once a month, in order to document which bees and butterflies were on the sites before we began. Then we created a plant list for the entire area that you see here in this map, which includes all of the counties in New York within the watershed, as well as neighboring counties. And we compared historical to contemporary observations, and we came up with a list. We have about 150 plant species for this project, which targets 49 native bee species that are at risk of local extinction, 31 butterfly species, and 13 moth species. And it includes the full spectrum of requirements, including host plants, pollen, and nectar plants, in order to support the widest network of species. We have a lot of different projects. You can see them on our site. This is an example of a site we did in Western Connecticut. We also worked on the Aspetuck Land Trust site in Southern Connecticut. And we've done sites across New England, all the way up to Maine. Grazing for biodiversity is another example of ways that we're trying to fit pollinator habitat restoration into working landscapes. We've looked at the impacts of livestock grazing on native pollinators, and then how prescribed burning can be used as a tool for restoring. So after grazing for a full season and then burning the landscape, we put the flock back out on the landscape again, and they were doing rotational grazing, which essentially means that the flock is given access to new pasture every 1 to 2 days. And every 6 weeks, they go back to the same paddock that they were at before. So what that does is it gives a chance for the landscape to grow back. And what we found was that as a result of this, a whole wide range of native plant species were able to not only flower, but also produce seeds. So the livestock were able to eat, they were able to gain weight, they gained a lot of weight. In fact, the sheep were about 180 pounds when I slaughtered them after 1.5 years. But also we had a whole range of native plants that were not, impacted negatively by the grazing, including plants like native St. John's wort, native goldenrod, native blueberry, native meadowsweet, native asters, little blue stem, Indian grass, yarrow, native strawberries. So the takeaway for this is that you can actually graze livestock and feed pollinators at the same time. You don't have to pick one or the other. It's possible to do both, but a lot depends upon the timing of the grazing and the intensity of the grazing. After we grazed for those 2 years, we determined that this landscape needed more plant diversity. And so we mowed the site down and then seeded it with a range of native species. There were 4 different seed mixes that I created that included about 60 different native flowers, herbaceous shrubs, and grasses and sedges. And then the seeds were seeded in the winter, which is when we recommend doing it, between November and January. They were broadcast, and within the first growing season, they were already beginning to flower, some of them. So you can see here native lupins, butterfly weed, partridge sensitive pea, butterfly milkweed we're growing in. And we continue to monitor. Solar is also a great opportunity for pollinators. In Massachusetts, we have the benefit that if sites are pollinator friendly, they actually get a credit from the state in the range of $3,500 per megawatt per year. And we've had the opportunity to design about 600 acres of native pollinator habitat in the past 3 years as a result of this project. All of the projects have site-specific seed mixes, mowing schedules, invasive species management protocol, and the plants support, at least a third of the plants support at-risk butterflies or moths or native bees that are pollen specialists. So as I mentioned, we try to track the impact of our projects as much as possible, as much as funding will allow. We typically do a 3-year study period, and we typically use native bumblebees and butterflies to measure whether a project was successful. So which were the bumblebees and butterflies on the site before we did anything. And then a few years after the plants have fully grown in and they're blooming, they're providing pollen, they're providing nectar, they're able to have their eggs, they're able to support Lepidoptera laying their eggs, which species were on the site as a result. So this here is the link to our website where you can download all of the projects I shared with you today. It's landscapeinteractions.com/projects. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan. I did share a link to your website in the chat too, so folks should be able to easily access it.
Okay.
I'm going to feed you a couple questions here. Question about the toolkits. Do you have any available for suburban house plots? They felt like the ones you were showing were for larger tracts of land.
Yeah, I moved a little fast through that, but the Pollinate Northampton toolkit is actually made for urban and suburban. So we created on average 800 to 1,000 square foot areas. That's pretty small. And those are ideal for people that don't have a lot of property.
Okay, that's great. This is more about working with municipalities. They're wondering how much a municipality might be paying to get sites back to natives. Just the cost range would be helpful. And which government entities and foundations partnered on these projects? Is there a good resource for these questions?
Yeah, to answer the second question, no, because it's really specific to each project. It's not like I've never obtained, the only government national or federal funding I've received for any of this work has been through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They've been our partner for doing some of the burning through the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. So you can look up U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, and find your local contact. I will not pretend that it's easy. It's really hard to find the right person for that. If you are on a farm, you can get some support through the NRCS and the Conservation Reserve Program.
Okay.
But as far as state or urban, municipal funding, some of our projects were funded through land trusts, some were funded through state grants, some were funded through private landowners, some were funded through nonprofits that either had their own funding, they raised money for it, or they got a grant independently. It's really a mix. As far as the estimating for the cost per site, I think on average, it really depends what size plant you want to get. If you're okay with really small landscape plugs, those can be anywhere from $1 to $4 each. Some people like to plant things that are a little bit bigger so that it's easier to weed and that they can actually appreciate, how nice it looks from the first or second year. So those can go anywhere from, $4 to $12 each per plug. And then, with shrubs and trees, again, if you're doing something like a riparian restoration, we would put in like a live steak. Sometimes that's $1 or $1.50, where sometimes we buy shrubs for $80 each, or even a tree for like anywhere from $50 to $300 each. So it really just depends. But if you're doing like very urban or suburban planting, I would say do your cost estimate at the higher end, and maybe you're estimating like $2 to $3 a square foot, or maybe even like $2 to $5 a square foot, including protection for deer, including needing to tarp with black plastic before you plant or do some sort of site prep. Whereas if you're doing like larger, restoration type work, you could be pricing at anywhere from 50 cents to $1.50 per square foot, including all of those things.
Okay. Here's a question about the bee strips. How large does a bee strip need to be effective in an urban garden?
I would say a 2x4 would be okay, 2 feet by 4 feet for urban or suburban. Whereas if it's a larger site, we might recommend 10 by 20 feet, or having multiple 2x4 areas, throughout a landscape. The idea is that you want to be able to keep track of it. You don't want it to get lost. So maybe mark it with a sign, or we sometimes recommend, you excavate this area, you're taking out the top 4 inches of soil and whatever is growing there. Then you could put in like a frame of 2x4 wood, for example, 2-inch by 4-inch pieces of wood, and just like kind of create like a little border, and then just basically return half the soil and put sand mixed in, and just basically keep it weed free.
Okay, sounds good. Here's a question about, when looking for natives to plant in my yard, would it be more beneficial to find out the native bees that are on the most decline and target their food source for planting, or picking one and having large swaths of that species?
The first one's better, but you want to have more than one plant per species. I mean, you do what you can do, but absolutely, like the biggest. So if you look around you, it's actually pretty intuitive. If you look around you and, your property or your town already has a lot of, let's say, maple, oak, pine, beech, birch, what have you. And maybe like people are already planting a lot of, echinacea and milkweed. You could say to yourself, okay, well, what is not around me? What is not on my property? What is not on my neighbor's property? And you'll find most likely that if you look at the list of species, whether it's bee, butterfly, moth, that is, listed by your state as at risk, maybe they have like a conservation ranking, like maybe they're listed as S3 or S2 or S1. So they're listed as a species of concern, or a local entomologist might tell you, oh, these are the species that probably need the most help. It's almost guaranteed that the plants that those species need are not there. And if they are there, it's only maybe a fraction of the total species that those pollinators need. So a lot of the bees that tend to be declining are the ones that nest in these really sandy soils, for example. And it's because everyone's planting lawns, and the lawns don't allow your soil to have like a natural gap where there's like a little dirt in between the plants.
Right.
And another problem is that people put a lot of mulch. So they have like native plants everywhere, and then it's just mulch. And if you don't have a nesting area, if it's just mulch and plants, well, then those bees can't really get underground. So that's why we recommend the bee nesting strip, because it's kind of a way of intentionally putting within a design an area that will not get mulch.
Sounds good. Hate mulch. We need more sandy soils. Okay, does Landscape Interactions have materials to help facilitate a volunteer organized baseline study of a site?
Well, it depends where you're located. You could start, at the easiest would probably be to just use iNaturalist, and you could create an iNaturalist project, and you can make it public. And then, so for example, let's say it's in Cleveland, you could say this is going to be like the Cleveland, pollinator project, and anyone in Cleveland who photographs a bee, a butterfly, a moth, even other things like, beetles or hoverflies, they could either add their observation to your project, or you could go in and you're allowed to, through a naturalist, basically take any observation within your geographic area. So in this case, it would be Cleveland, and you can add it to your project. And so that's a way to create a baseline, because you can actually go back many, many years in iNaturalist, and you can see what things people have observed in Cleveland. So you might already be able to create a baseline based off of that. The thing is, it's not really scientifically valid because you don't know how intensively it's being surveyed. So maybe, people just randomly took pictures in Cleveland, and maybe they only were able to, even get a picture of just the most common bees and butterflies, because it's hard to photograph and certainly to identify a lot of the non-bumblebees. So then you're going to go in and you're going to do your project, and then you're going to start maybe actively tracking bees. Well, your data is going to be skewed because now you're like more intensively surveying. So of course you're going to have better results, or maybe pick up species that are more or less common. So what I would recommend is talking to your local university or your local agricultural extension and seeing if they could maybe help you to go out on your property and to do one full spring, summer, and fall of surveys, and just maybe pick one group that's like very easy to identify. So let's just say bumblebees and butterflies, and just survey that for a full year. Then you can do your plantings and try to target, more specific plantings that might support those more specialized pollinators or the ones that are declining. And then go back and have that same university or extension do the same exact survey on the same site, at the same intensity, maybe 3 or 4 years from now, and show the difference. That's basically what we're doing. It sounds a lot easier than it really is. It's also expensive. Usually you have to pay people to do surveys. So I usually have a budget for that, where I will partner with a scientist and we will pay them to do the surveys as part of the project. But if someone ever wanted to talk about doing that, I'm happy to have that conversation, and you can reach out to me, through my website.
Well, thank you so much, Evan. It was an inspiring talk. So was Mel's, and I appreciate you being with us today. We didn't get to some of the questions, but I'll probably be in touch with you over the next day.
Okay, yeah, no problem. And hopefully we can just put my email in the chat, and if people want to, ask something or talk about something more specific, they're welcome to reach out to me through my email.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. Take care.
Bye now.